Yeah, it's my pleasure today to have an opportunity to present with Sharon, who is actually my former director at the ministry. So if you have any really tough questions about the ministry, Sharon can't just automatically point over to me because she was there not too long ago, right? So yeah, we're all here because we recognize the important relationship between agriculture and the agri-food industry and water. In Ontario, there isn't really a single one-size-fits-all piece of legislation that governs water resource management for agriculture. So as Sharon mentioned, we're going to try and cover a few of those things from our perspectives, but it's certainly not going to give you the complete picture of water resource management in Ontario. So I'll start by giving an overview and then talk a little bit about some of the details of the policies around water takings in Ontario, so the Ontario Water Resources Act and the Permit to Take Water program, etc. Sharon will then talk about some OMAFRA policies related to agriculture, and then talk a little bit about some current focuses for related to water and agriculture, including climate change. So just in terms of the big picture, in Canada, the way the Constitution set up is that waters that lay solely in the boundaries of the province fall within the constitutional authority of that province. And another important aspect for Ontario is that unlike most provinces, Ontario, the government has never vested ownership of water in the Crown. So water in Ontario is still a resource that's held in common by all Ontarians. So what the Ministry of Environment does through our legislation and in partnership with other ministries such as OMAFRA and Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and partners such as CAs and other agencies, we implement a number of legislation, pieces of legislation, regulations, programs, etc. to manage water, again, for sort of in terms of managing it for the commons. This is an extremely busy picture. And I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I just wanted to illustrate sort of the myriad of legislation and programs, policies that are involved in water management. These cover different scales from site-specific approvals like water taking permits to all the way up to programs that involve managing water across the Great Lakes Basin. And they also cover all different aspects of the water cycle, from managing stormwater runoff to water takings to managing drainage, things that relate to watershed planning, so looking at it in an integrated way. But what I'd like to focus on next is the policies around water taking in Ontario. So the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change has a policy for water quantity management, and it's simply to ensure the fair sharing, conservation and sustainable use of ground and surface water in the province. And the main piece of legislation that we use to do that is the Ontario Water Resources Act. It includes tools that focus on water use, such as a requirement for anyone wanting to take or withdraw more than 50,000 litres on any day in a year to get a permit from the ministry. And there are exceptions from this requirement for domestic use, livestock watering, and for emergency purposes. There's also authority under the Act for the province to charge industrial and commercial water users for their water takings. And the purpose of these charges is to help the province recover its costs for water quantity management. I just wanted to show this just to cover a few key points, milestones in the evolution of the Permit to Take Water program. So it started in 1961, basically to respond to a need to resolve conflicts and interference between water users. We kind of reached a critical mass of water taking at that point where we started to see significant interference issues. So the permit program was brought in place at that point. In the late 90s, there was a proposal to put water in a tanker ship from Lake Superior and ship it to Asia. Once this proposal got the public attention, it raised major concerns in Ontario and across the Great Lakes Basin about the issue of sustaining water in the Great Lakes Basin and not allowing it to be removed from the basin. So that led Ontario to establish the water taking and transfer regulation, which among other things banned the movement of water outside of any of Ontario's major water basins, so the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin, the Hudson River Basin, and the Nelson Basin. In early 2000s, there was increasing concern, a little bit like today, about the sustainability of water taking within our watersheds. around the use of water by certain industries. So that resulted in the mid-2004, 2005, to some changes to the water taking and transfer regulation. I just want to highlight a couple of the big things that happened at that point. The regulation at that point more clearly defined the types of matters that the ministry would consider when reviewing a permit application, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. The other important thing that happened at that point was, before then there was no requirement to monitor or report water taking, so we really had no clear idea of how much water was actually being used in Ontario. That changed in 2004 and 5, where there was a phasing in of a reporting requirement. So there's now information on how much water is being used by permitted water takers at least. 2007, back a couple of years, 2005, Ontario signed an agreement with a huge long name, Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin Sustainable Water Resources Agreement with Quebec and the Great Lakes states about managing water use within the basin, and in particular banning, or at least strictly regulating, diversions of water out of the basin and movement of water within the basin. So from 2007 to 2015, Ontario took a number of measures to implement that agreement within Ontario. And so that kind of brings us up to the point we are today. The water taking and transfer regulation basically simply sets out the rules we follow when we're considering applications for permits to take water. So it requires the permit to take water director at the ministry to consider things such as ecosystem natural functions, the availability of water for existing uses, water conservation and efficiency, and other public and private interests in water when they're considering a permit application. There's requirements to notify people potentially affected by a permit application or a water taking, including municipalities and conservation authorities. There's something in the regulation related to high-use watersheds, which restricts certain types of takings in areas of the province where an assessment was done that determined that the demand for water exceeded a sustainable level of supply. Again, I mentioned the reporting requirement, and just wanted to reiterate that the way the legislative framework is now, the permit to take water isn't a mechanism we have that assigns rights to water like the approach they have in Australia. It's just a permission to use water that's time limited, usually no more than 10 years, and the ministry has at any point the ability to adjust, add conditions, or revoke a permit in an extreme case if necessary. And there's no mechanism within the existing framework that explicitly establishes water use priorities within Ontario right now. And I think that's important. Probably we may get into it a little bit in our discussion after, but that's potentially a gap in our current framework in Ontario. I just wanted to share a little bit of data, recent data on permitted water use. This first slide shows number of water taking permits. As of July of this year, there were just over 5,000 active permit to take water. Among all of them, there's about an even split between the number of permits issued for surface water taking versus groundwater taking. In terms of number of permits, most of them are for agriculture, almost half. And again, within agriculture, it's about an even split between surface and groundwater. In terms of how much is actually being used, first off, this is information for 2016. In terms of permitted takings, there's about 378 trillion liters of water permitted to be taken a year, and less than a third of this is, in 2016 at least, was actually reported to have been taken. The graph here shows the light lines are the permitted amounts, the dark blue lines are the reported amounts, and different than the numbers of permits in terms of water being used, the vast majority of water is being used by the industrial sector, and most of this water use is for once through cooling, so thermal power plants, water just going through to cool and then going right back into the source. An important issue to recognize here, though, even though most of these other uses take relatively small amount, it's important to think about where this water use is taking place. Somewhere like Bruce Power and Ontario Power Generation are taking water for once through cooling out of the Great Lakes, but a lot of these other takings are taking water from groundwater and from inland water sources. And so I've included just a map here showing permit to take water points across the province. You can see that most permits are located in southern Ontario, and then there's a huge cluster of permits down in southwestern Ontario, in particular in the Norfolk Sand Plain. Oops, sorry. Oops, one more. I just wanted to highlight some of the recent actions that the province has been taking around water takings. As we've talked about earlier, last year was a dry year in Ontario. There was quite a lot of drought. And so partly in response to that, and then partly into some sort of renewed concerns over water bottling and the impact that water bottling might be having on groundwater sources, particularly in areas where those groundwater sources are being shared with municipal water supplies. The province has taken a number of actions. They're highlighted on the left here. At the end of last year, the province implemented a 2-year moratorium on any new or increased groundwater takings for water bottling. There's stricter rules that have been put in place for the renewal of existing permits for water bottling. And earlier this year, there was a new $500 per million liter charge for water bottlers, and the purpose of that charge is to help the province recover the costs that we incur to manage these groundwater takings by water bottlers. During the 2-year moratorium, there's some work underway and further work planned in the areas of science and research, so helping to improve understanding of ground and surface water, including consideration of the impacts of future climate change and population and economic growth in the province. There's also work underway to review the current framework for water taking in Ontario. A little bit more review about rules around water bottling to see if any other changes might be needed. But more importantly in my mind is looking more broadly at the rules around water takings to make sure that we have measures in place to protect and conserve water going forward. So looking at things, asking ourselves, do we have the right tools to address cumulative impacts of multiple water takings, particularly in the areas of the province that are prone to stress, water quantity stress? Are there the right provisions to protect environmental water needs? And if we are going to be facing increasing situations where there's not enough water to go around, is the framework set up to decide who gets water when there isn't enough to go around? And so we're looking at our framework and asking ourselves those questions, among others, and have already started to, and will be consulting with stakeholders and the public, indigenous communities to help inform both the science part of things as well as the policy review. So with that, I will hand it over to Sharon to talk a bit more about things from a MAFRA's point of view.
But now I want to switch gears a little bit, because a lot of the focus recently and in the near future, in the immediate future, has been more on the issues around water quality, and also traditional issues around how water is managed on farm. And agricultural drainage has been a long-standing area that we have legislation in place for to manage how we can get that balance between economic and environmental benefits from the water for agriculture. So the common law in Ontario does allow for landowners to protect their property from the water that's flowing on it, but they cannot alter it in a way that can't alter a water course to the extent that it really impacts a neighboring property. And so we have a long-standing, one of the oldest pieces of legislation, the Drainage Act, which defines a process to allow property owners to come together and work with their municipality to come to communal solutions for drainage. And in addition to the Drainage Act, we've got the Tile Drainage Act and the Agricultural Tile Drainage Installation Act, which manage both providing financing for drainage and also how that drainage can be installed. And one of the competing uses, of course, with agricultural drainage is increased concern about what impact that drainage is having on either the quality of water or on the wetlands that many perceive may be drained. And so OMAFRA has been working with and continues to work with all the ministries that are involved, particularly Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, in trying to get that right balance between meeting the needs for agriculture and also the increasing concerns around wetland protection and biodiversity. We have changes, or we continue to tighten the rules in how we administer the Drainage Act and the programs around that to ensure that we're not supporting the drainage of provincially significant wetlands. And we work really closely with MNRF to ensure that there's practical solutions where there's interactions between what we're trying to accomplish under the Drainage Act and what conservation authorities are responsible for under the Conservation Authorities Act in terms of flood control and other benefits. So we have practical partnerships that have been developed over a long period of time to try and resolve the potential conflicts between the two. And we have many practical solutions on the ground to show that the Drainage Act, even in its current form, is flexible enough to allow for innovative ways to develop and restore wetland drains in a way that gets you the environmental benefits as well as the agricultural benefits. So that's one area of where we're continuing to try to resolve those conflicts between competing interests. Another area that has taken a lot of our attention, I would say over the last number of years, is certainly the area of water quality, in particular the impact that agriculture, its contribution to serious environmental issues, the algae issue in particular on Lake Erie. And so we have been working with our colleagues both nationally with Environment Canada and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and with our provincial colleagues, MNRF and MOECC, to implement some of the commitments that have been made under the binational Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was updated in 2012. And was subsequently developed a domestic Canada-Ontario, updated our Canada-Ontario agreement to identify those things that we would be doing on the Ontario side to deliver on our commitments under the binational agreement. Of particular interest to us is the targets. One of the priority issues that was addressed in the updated water quality agreement was around the issue of nutrients and its impact on Lake Erie. And in these new agreements, specific targets, there was commitments to set specific targets by 2016, and then develop a domestic action plan to reduce phosphorus loadings to Lake Erie. At the same time, the province was working collaboratively with at the state level in the U.S., particularly Ohio and Michigan, and signed a collaborative agreement among those parties, similarly to achieve significant reductions and achieve the environmental goals in the Western Basin. And we've gone one step further with our Great Lakes Protection Act. We actually established those targets as legislated targets under the Act. So that has triggered a lot of activities. So around phosphorus, we have spent a great deal of effort working with all of our partners to try and tackle this issue. And so why is phosphorus such a concern? It really is one of the major contributors to the excessive phosphorus algae growth that you're seeing in Lake Erie. And again, this satellite picture is from a few years ago, but again, you're seeing a fairly significant algae bloom in Lake Erie this year, given the kinds of wet spring that we had, and now the recent, which ended finally today, the recent heat wave that has contributed to the growth of that algae bloom. This isn't a new problem. We thought we'd had it fixed in the 70s. We spent many years and large investments in municipal infrastructure upgrades, only to find that the problem re-emerged as a result of a number of factors. We got our worst algae bloom in history in 2011, and then in 2014 it was enough to close the water supplies for Toledo, Ohio. So it is both a health issue and an environmental issue. There's impacts to fish and wildlife. It impacts the ecosystem's functions. It can, as we've seen with Toledo, it can have human health impacts, not just from impacts on the drinking water, but also in terms of recreational swimming. And it has a significant economic impact. So it's a huge issue that we have focused a lot of attention on. And although agriculture is one of the contributing factors to this issue, it is much more, like every environmental issue, it's quite complex. And so, although we want to do our part in the agricultural world, we have to also consider that some of these impacts are coming as a result of climate change, as a result of the introduction of invasive species like zebra and quagga mussels. There's been lots of impact as a result of changing land use, not just from agriculture, but from urbanized landscapes. There's also been variations in the types of phosphorus that we're seeing changes in. So we're seeing a higher level of dissolved phosphorus, which is more bioavailable and for the growth of algae. And then, of course, there's historical phosphorus that's in the streams and from historical uses, and that can get released into the environment. So these are complex interactions that are resulting in algae blooms, and to find the right solutions means that there's just not one silver bullet. Okay, so we're going to move along. One of the concerns is around most of the phosphorus loss that we're seeing is in the non-growing season, and so there's a fair emphasis on looking at how do we ensure that the land is covered over the winter period, and also ensuring that nutrients are not applied during that part of the period. We're also working very collaboratively. So just picking up on the theme from on our earlier presentations, we have established a fairly collaborative process involving multi-stakeholder working groups, a farm leaders advisory group, and an agriculture sector technical working group that's advising on all the types of actions that we might be able to bring to the table to solve this complex problem. And it's not just an agriculture problem. Working with the other agencies, there's actions that have been identified in Lake Erie Domestic Action Plan that address all the other sources as well, municipal sources, and build on a range of tools, whether it's education and outreach, more research to look at what the best solutions are, and regulation as well. In terms of agriculture, we've focused our policy around 3 areas. One, the first column being actions that are associated strictly with managing nutrients better. The second column is around actions for improving soil health, so that when the soil is healthy, we know that it can hold the water better, it can hold the nutrients better. And then the third column, which links back to the water quantity issue, is around managing water in those excess weather events, dealing with issues around drainage and erosion, and looking at the water management on a watershed scale so that we can deal with large water issues from the extreme weather events. So next step on this is to continue to reach out to finalize the action plan. We actually have committed to having a final plan out in February of 2018. So similarly, I'll quickly just run through that middle column. I talked about soil health. We've also been doing a lot of policy work around trying to improve, what do we need to do to improve soil health in the province? Again, we have another collaborative working group and we've undertaken one round of public consultation on identifying what needs to go in a soil strategy, what kinds of things do we need to look at in terms of best management practices, how do we support those, what kind of science do we need, how do we monitor progress. And so we're very close to actually releasing a draft strategy for public consultation, and I look forward to receiving input from any and all of you. It will be posted on the Environmental Bill of Rights Registry. So this will be key in terms of its co-benefit to improving water quality and also helping to manage water quantity issues. Of course, it's not only a benefit to the environment, it is really important in terms of agricultural productivity. So, I guess, did I get right? Just about right on? So lots of things going on. We haven't been as much focused on the water quantity issues as we may become more involved in water quantity as we see the impacts of climate change. And so that links back to the work that Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and Brent's leading on the review of the water taking rules. We'll finalize and then start to implement our commitments under the Lake Erie action plan. And we will implement our agricultural actions that are under the Climate Change Action Plan, and the soil strategy that I mentioned is actually one of the commitments because of soil's role in both sequestering carbon and reducing it as a source of GHGs. So it's been a busy policy landscape, and I don't see it getting simpler anytime soon.